Hello, and welcome to Western Landowner Alliance's final water webinar of our Spring 2025 series. We are so grateful to all of the people who have joined us for this series over the past 6 months. I'm Thomas Plank, the Colorado River Basin Communications Coordinator for WLA, and this is Morgan Wagoner, WLA's Western Water Program Director. We also have 3 special guests for today's topic, which is one of the most interesting and complicated of the issues we have discussed so far this year: compensated water conservation programs. On this webinar, we will examine the successes and challenges of compensated water conservation programs, where a governmental entity will pay water rights holders to not use water allocated to them. We'll take a deep dive into what these programs mean for landowners and water users, their shortcomings in terms of cost and potential permanent removal of irrigated farmland, and what opportunities might exist for finding common ground solutions for addressing Western water shortages within the guardrails of voluntary, temporary, compensated reduction in consumptive water use programs. Now I'd like to pass it over to Morgan, who will provide a brief introduction to WLA and our work.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. WLA is a landowner-led, nonpartisan organization advancing policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species across the American West. In a nutshell, we're a network of landowners, managers, and partners dedicated to keeping the working lands of the West whole and healthy for the benefit of both people and wildlife. Our work is guided by people with boots on the ground who understand the importance and practical realities of agricultural production, land and water management, and natural resource conservation. We focus on empowering landowners and managers with the resources, knowledge, and public policies to support land and water stewardship.
Thank you, Morgan. Today's webinar will feature a panel discussion followed by a brief audience Q&A session. The goal of today's panel discussion is to explore the topic of voluntary compensated conservation programs. We recognize that landscapes, communities, and water management decisions are incredibly diverse throughout the West, and that no one program, policy, or practice can fix the pressing issues of our time. The purpose of these webinars is to share information and resources and provide an opportunity for landowners and experts to exchange knowledge, and together find ways to build out a more robust toolbox to support the stewardship of whole and healthy lands and water in the West. As the saying goes, there is no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot. Now it is our pleasure to introduce today's speakers, 3 very well-placed people with years of experience in water conservation and stewardship in Colorado and across the West: Ann Castle, Mike Higuera, and Raquel Flinker.
Ann is a senior fellow at the Getches Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment at the University of Colorado Law School, focusing on Western water issues, including Colorado River policy and management and tribal water interests. She has served in the Department of the Interior and was chair of the Upper Colorado River Commission. Joining us as well is Mike, Agricultural Operations Manager for Western State Ranches, based at the Figure 4 Ranch, northeast of Delta, Colorado. Mike's work focuses on holistic planned grazing, regenerative agriculture, and stewardship of natural resources on the land. Last, but certainly not least, is Raquel, the Director of Interstate and Regional Water Resources at the Colorado River District, where she leads efforts on Colorado River Basin-wide water supply challenges and interstate collaboration. The Colorado River District is a local government that exists to serve water users across the 15 West Slope Colorado counties. The district does this through legal and legislative advocacy, technical and engineering support, community outreach and education, and multi-benefit water project grant funding. Thank you all for being here today.
And now I'm excited. Let me pull up my script again. Now I'm excited to get to our panel discussion with a question for Ann. Ann, what is a compensated water conservation program, and how do they work?
Thank you, Thomas, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to talk about water conservation programs in general, and then more specifically about the System Conservation Pilot Program in the Upper Colorado River Basin. So what are they? Generically, these water conservation programs are intentional reductions of consumptive water use. That's the broad framework. And that can take a number of different forms. It could be full season fallowing or split season fallowing, switching to lower water use crops, deficit irrigation, efficiency projects, either agricultural or municipal projects that result in reduced water usage, or reservoir storage forbearance, meaning you've got a storage right and you decline to exercise it, so that water remains in the system. A hallmark of all of these programs that we're going to be talking about is that they are temporary, so the water savings is temporary, they're voluntary, not mandatory, and they're compensated. So the one that we'll talk most about, and I think the three of your panelists are most familiar with, is the Colorado River System Conservation Pilot Program, or the SCPP. That has been operating in the Upper Colorado River Basin for several years. So those are the states of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. It operated from 2015 to 2018. And during that period of time, it was funded through both state and federal sources. It operated last year and in 2023, and it was funded through the Inflation Reduction Act. There was $4 billion designated in the IRA for Colorado River drought and climate resilience projects. So the funding came through the feds. The authorization for that program expired at the end of last year, but there is legislation in both the House and the Senate to reauthorize that program. And the legislation in the Senate passed in mid-June, so now it's over to the House, and hopefully that will get reauthorized. But there isn't an SCPP program in the Upper Basin for 2025. People are usually pretty interested in how much it pays, and that has varied over time. In 2023, there was a starting rate of $150 per acre foot saved, but there were negotiated rates on top of that, and the full prices paid varied between $200 and $650 per acre foot. That was in 2023. In 2024, the program switched to fixed rates, but they varied by state. And you can see here what they were, varying from $300 to a little bit over $500 per acre foot. So in determining what projects are going to be accepted into the SCPP program and compensated through the government funding, these are some of the things that the Upper Colorado River Commission that was administering the SCPP, these are factors that the commission looked at. Is there a history of recent consumptive use? So if there's a water right that hasn't been used for the last 5 or 10 years, that's not a great candidate for a conservation program. Will the water get to where we want it to go? Big question. Is there a need to shepherd this water, and can shepherding be done to get the saved water, the quantity of saved water, to a reservoir or someplace where you want it to end up? How much water are we going to save? And this is an administrative consideration, because doing a contract and evaluation for 10 acre feet requires almost the same amount of time as doing a contract for 250 acre feet. And so they're going to be looking at the quantity of water saved and trying to focus on where they get the biggest bang for the buck. Ease or difficulty of verification. These are things like Is there a bunch of different small tracts, or is it one big one? Is the land sub-irrigated? So you have to factor that into the calculation of water savings, things like that. And then another factor that the Upper Colorado River Commission looked at was, are there multiple benefits from this savings? So will the saved water stay in the stream and generate some riparian or environmental benefits? And then I'll just briefly mention factors that are considered by water users. And this came out in evaluation of the SCPP programs as they were operated. Obviously, economics is the first factor. What's the price that you're going to get for saving this water? And how do you compare that to the lost profit, the profit that you would have made using the water for irrigating crops or whatever was done with it? Is this a hedge against volatility in commodity prices? So is it kind of an insurance policy if prices go down? And then, I think water users evaluate the administrative hassle. What's the application process like? Does it take too long? When am I going to know? So I can make decisions about buying seed and inputs to a crop if I'm going to grow a crop. And then what happens when I'm done? If I've signed up for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, what's my land going to be like if I haven't irrigated it for that period of time? Can I grow another crop instantly, or are there residual effects? And then I think an important consideration, at least in the Upper Colorado River system, is what's happened to the water I saved. Best case scenario is that the system benefits and the risk to Upper Basin water users goes down. There's less risk of curtailment. There's less risk that I'm going to lose access to this water right in the future. That's best case scenario. Or is somebody up or downstream just going to pick it up and use it if I don't? And then worst case scenario, at least I think in the Upper Colorado River Basin, is that if I save this water, it's going to flow down to the lower basin and they get to use more. And I don't like that. So those are just some of the things that I think water users have been considering in deciding whether to participate in these programs.
Thank you so much for that informative explanation, Anne. And a question for Raquel to add on to this. Raquel, could you provide an overview of why we're continuing to talk about water conservation programs?
Thank you, Thomas. Let me pull up some screens to help with this question. And it really is a pleasure to be here and be on this panel with Anne and Mike. So thank you for having me, and it's good to see so many folks on the webinar. So I think to answer that question on why are we even talking about this, I think it's helpful to just provide some background. And I like this simplified map of the basin. And so the purple area is the upper basin. So Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico. The lower basin in this brownish color is Nevada, California, and Arizona. You can see the two largest reservoirs in the system, Lakes Powell and Meade. And you can also see the territory of the Colorado River District here, this light blue area in Colorado. And around 65% of the natural flows of the Colorado River start within our district. So just wanted to emphasize that. And the problem that this basin faces is that the system is out of balance, right? The amount of water that exists in the system is less than the amount of water that's being used. And we've been playing this on repeat for 2 decades now. And that has caused Lakes Powell and Meade to slowly but surely drop. And there has been efforts to try to figure this out, and the 2007 interim guidelines are part of that. But in terms of supply, what has happened in the system is that we've seen hotter, drier conditions since, the 2000s, more more drastically. And studies show that for every 1 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature, we're seeing stream flow decreases of 4 to 7% per year. And the graph on the left has temperatures in Garfield County. It just happens to be where the River District offices are located. And so I just wanted to show this as an example. Temperatures have increased 3.5 degrees over the last century-ish. And so with that, you would see, right, like around 20% decrease in stream flows. And when we look at the natural flows of the Colorado River at Glenwood Springs, that's basically what we're seeing. We're seeing a drop of 19% if we're looking at the numbers from the beginning of this graph. And I should say on the y-axis, you're seeing acre foot volumetric flows of the river per year, and x-axis is the water year. And so if we get the beginning of this graph and we run an average, we have 2.4 million acre feet. And if we look at the end of this graph, we're looking at 2 million acre feet. And that, you're seeing that throughout the Colorado River Basin. And so here you see the capacity of Lake Mead, or the actual volume at Lake Mead and Powell, stacked on top of each other. So the lighter blue is Lake Mead over time. So this starts in the 1960s and is ending in like 2023, I think is last year here. And the dark blue is Lake Powell stacked on top. And together, these reservoirs have a capacity of around 50 million acre feet. And we were there definitely in the 80s. You can see we even went over that. But starting in the 2000s, we were close to that 50 million acre feet. And we've just seen these reservoirs drop. And the 2007 interim guidelines came to try to help with that, but it didn't really, right? We've continued to see a drop. And a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, the levels at Lake Powell dropped to 3.521, and it was very concerning. And the Bureau had the drought response operations agreement, so releases from reservoirs in the upper basin to try to help prop up Lake Powell. And this is the problem. And this timeline shows some of the efforts to try to respond to this. So you had the interim guidelines in 2007. As Ann mentioned, there was the SCPP program, 10 years ago to test out this concept of conserving water to help with this supply demand issue. In 2019, you had the drought contingency plans that talked about demand management as well in line with this. So demand management is also water conservation type program. And then more recently, we've had the other versions of SCPP. And so that is why we talk about this as a potential piece of helping to solve this supply demand issue in the basin at large. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you both for those explanations of these really complex programs and the need for them. Now a question for you, Mike. You have direct on-the-ground experience with these kinds of water conservation programs. And for you, Raquel, as well, from the higher level view of an agency, both of you, what do you find to be the strengths and weaknesses of these kinds of water conservation programs from a high level perspective and on the ground reality?
Well, I'll start off with the higher level or policy level stuff and then get to on the ground based on our experience. I think that this is really the best alternative to buy and dry. And I think, that buy and dry is a huge threat to agriculture It removes operations permanently. It changes the community. It has potential side effects for wildlife or other conservation values that rely on irrigated agriculture. So this is a way to try to make up for a lack of supply that can be done on individual ranches at different times. Temporarily, it keeps the agricultural operation still running. I think, another advantage is that a temporary compensated voluntary program is much preferred to an involuntary or compulsory conservation program where the state says everybody's getting less water to deal with the problem. That I think would be devastating. Ranches and farms run on tiny margins, and if everybody had to reduce consumption according to some number that came from somewhere outside of their individual decision making, that would be really, really tough. So I feel like this program is also really unique in that it can essentially preserve the status quo. If we say to farmers and ranchers, those of you who are willing to participate in this program and think that it will be helpful to your program, presumably that's why you would participate in it, and we can make up for this lack of supply, the other farmers and ranchers who say, I don't really want to participate, or this doesn't work for my operation, or cities or other water users, can essentially preserve the status quo and things can move along as they have for those folks, while people who are voluntarily participating can help sort of hopefully, make strides towards increasing, the amount of water in our reservoirs and our supplies. So I think those are some of the policy benefits. Anne alluded to this one as far as like on the ground goes. When you're entering into a program like this as a producer, you're doing it like in the fall or late winter. At least that's how it happened with SCPP last year. And you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what the snowpack's going to do. So you're entering into an agreement at a certain number, and you can start to make calculations if you understand how it's going to affect your production. So it's another source of revenue for a farmer or ranch. It's a way to hedge against, if it had been a really bad year, then certainly a payment instead of trying to grow hay with not a lot of water. That's certainly a better way to go. Obviously, all of these things need to have sideboards, which, we can probably talk about later today. As far as weaknesses to a program like this, Anne alluded to the complexity of the program, and her slides talked about a lot of the things that need to happen. Transaction costs are high in doing something like this as a government agency or, some entity paying farmers and ranchers. From an on-the-ground perspective, there are applications to fill out, there are decisions to make that can be complex. And obviously, some people are better suited to doing that to others. And I think, again, that's where the voluntary idea here is really helpful because people are compelled to participate in a program like this. This program may ultimately be more expensive than buy and dry to solve the problem. But I think there are a lot of societal advantages to having a program like this. There's also risk to the ag producer, as I was alluding to, if they participate in the program and, they've deficit irrigated a field, for example, and it's harmed that field into future years. Those are things that we're very much looking into in our participation to try to figure those things out. So.
Thank you, Mike. I will add to that too. I try not to be repetitive because everything that Mike just said resonates a lot with conversations we have at the River District. And I think the positives, the strengths, definitely that it's better than uncompensated mandatory curtailment. And I think that it is also positive that it shows how the Upper Basin can be part of the solution in some way, even though it's a small way. And as Mike said, it provides flexibility to producers. It can incentivize and help explore drought resiliency strategies. And I think specifically to SCPP in 2024, they did incorporate feedback from the 2023 program and did improve on it. And the timing, as Ann and Mike have alluded to, shifted, right? The program was initialized, at the very end of 2023, 2022, I guess, to go into 23, and people were struggling to make these decisions. It was very last minute. So for the 2024 iteration, it started earlier. There was a focus in the drought resiliency piece It required the irrigation water provider to approve the application. It allowed for feedback from anyone really who wanted to receive these applications. And I think that was all positive. I think there are weaknesses that continue or, concerns. To us, a big concern is that the conserved water isn't stored in a reservoir for the benefit of the upper basin, and it just becomes system water. And at times the system water can just make it so the lower basin continues to overuse, right? And at the expense of agriculture diminishing in the upper basin. I think another big piece to the program is that, as Anne mentioned, there's in the 2024 version, there was a fixed compensation per state. And there wasn't recognition that different regions for them to participate, they need to be compensated in a different manner. And so with that, for example, there was a project in Pueblo that wanted to participate, but they were requesting being compensated at a higher level, and that didn't go anywhere. And we would see participation from Front Range entities as something positive because they use Colorado River and should be part of this solution as well. And I think the other concern is around administering the program. And for example, there were two examples of this recently. One was Grand Valley Irrigation Company, where they had producers in their system participating. And because of that, they would have to reduce their diversion. And that could impact push water and could have some unintended consequences. And those just need to be evaluated to make sure that there aren't negative consequences to systems and producers, but also that depending on who participates, especially let's say in the upper Colorado River, you could make it so Trans-Mountain diverters are not being called by that senior participant in an SCPP type program. And Trans-Mountain diverters can end up taking more water, and that is 100% depletion, right? There's no return flows from Trans-Mountain diverters, and you could end up creating an unintended consequence that is not positive to the intent of the program. And just lastly, I will say that there are at times soil health impact concerns, as well as, and alluded to this, to future crop impacts. At times, if you fallow land, you have impacts for years to come. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Really appreciate that. So for the next question, I'm going to ask Anne and Mike to do a little, some combination here. One of the things that we're really trying to focus on at Western Landowners Alliance is how programs like these impact producers, particularly when it comes to the challenges. So, Anne, I'm wondering if you, from your perspective, could discuss some of these challenges that landowners can deal with and some of the concerns and fears that you might have heard from folks being involved in programs like these. And also, both for you and Mike, some of the greatest opportunities. And Mike, I'm hoping to get a little more of an understanding on how you balance the economic aspect of this. I mean, Anne went through the different costs of acre feet, what that looks like with those questions of fallowing and difference. I know that Western State Branches is really focused on using the scientific method and experimentation for both water use and agriculture in Delta, which is in the Colorado River Basin. But if you guys could help producers understand, and the folks on this chat, what some of those concerns are, and how you guys interact with those, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I'll take a crack at it. And I think with respect to challenges, all three of us have talked about some of the challenges just in the time that we've had so far. So I'll just hit the highlights. And I will say, with respect to the SCPP, I mentioned that it most recently was active in 2023 and 2024. And after the 2023 program, the Upper Colorado River Commission staff made a huge effort to go back and talk to participants in the program about what worked for them, what didn't work, and also talk to people who didn't sign up for the program but might have, and try to find out why they didn't. There is a lessons learned document that talks about those conversations and what was learned from 2023. It's on the Upper Colorado River Commission website called Lessons Learned. So you can take a look at that. But timing for proposals is huge. You know, if we don't start taking applications for water conservation projects until like April before the irrigation season, that's way too late. People need to make decisions about farm inputs way before that. And so it was clear that producers want to see an application process that starts in the early fall before the next irrigation season. During that evaluation, it came out that fixed pricing was preferred to the sort of one-off negotiations. People want to know what they're going to get and not have to argue back and forth about what they ought to get. Now, that's not universal, and Raquel referred to this as well. There are differences in the value of the saved water, and those need to be taken into account. And people want clarity and transparency on how applications are going to be evaluated and how conserved consumptive use is going to be calculated. And I saw there was a question about, is consumptive use the same as ET? And basically the answer is yes. They're looking at ET from one season where there was full irrigation, say, to the next season in a conservation program and seeing what the difference is. In terms of opportunities, you know, Mike talked about the ability to hedge not only against having a dry year and not having enough water, but also maybe a really wet year when the price for alfalfa drops a whole bunch. And so it's kind of an insurance policy that at least you can evaluate it that way. It also provides a way for farmers and ranchers to test new water management strategies. So, you know, maybe drip irrigation or different crops like kernza or, you know, some other crop, and still get paid. So it reduces the risk for testing new strategies or new crops. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. You're on mute, Mike.
There we go. I'll dive in and give you guys a little bit of an explanation of what we did. We run a cattle ranch and we participated in the system conservation pilot program last year. We enrolled probably about 10% of our irrigation water in the program. That affected about 25% of our fields or the acreage that we're, you know, growing grass and hay on. The payment that we received was probably equivalent to about 10% of our annual revenue. And what we did was we took about 8 fields and irrigated them to June 1 and then turned the water off. And we took another 8 fields next to those fields, kind of similar, irrigated them to July 1 and then turned the water off. So we were being paid for the water we weren't using after those shutoff dates. And what we decided to do was to get Colorado State University to monitor our activities. So they were measuring the amount of water saved using different techniques. They were monitoring the amount of forage grown and the amount of forage that we didn't grow, so we could understand that. And you know, we take this kind of scientific approach to this stuff because we feel like there are a lot of risks to making these decisions. And if we can take that information and that experience that we're having and share it with other farmers and ranchers or policymakers, we'll be able to make better policy in the future. The people paying for the water need to understand how much water is really being saved. The farmers and ranchers need to understand what are the effects to my operation. And Colorado State University will come back for the next 3 years and monitor those fields to see how they were affected in subsequent years. So we've put out some information on that already. There'll be more later. But that's what we're trying to do to understand, how does this affect our operation? And we looked at the payment that we received as something that could make us whole on what we anticipated when we were signing up for the program we would lose in terms of forage. And we felt like we'd have a little bit of a cushion on top of that. So we thought that made sense to us, from an economic perspective. To Ann's point about management, we're looking into and curious if stressing our fields like this, which frankly isn't in some of the fields where we have lesser water rights, it's not uncommon to a bad drought year. We're wondering if we can actually grow the roots of these plants deeper, and we monitor this stuff in conjunction with trying to, run our operation regeneratively. But there may be things like that. Like, I just had someone come out and walk our fields, our irrigated fields with us and look at this stuff. And there's some argument that stressing these plants will push their roots deeper, which is something that we want to have in place to deal with the lessening water situation that we're incurring, even if there isn't a program. And we're just incurring drought and low snowpack years and whatnot. We want our roots as deep as possible so they can access water further down into the ground. So those are some of the things that we considered and that we're doing to help better understand this and hopefully advance programs like this.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate that insight. This next question I have is a really pretty big question for both Anne and Raquel. These compensated programs appear to be trying to decrease the gap between water supply and demand. Will there come a time when the gap becomes too big to pay for? If so, what does that mean for the future of water in the Colorado River Basin?
I guess I'll start and then I'll turn it over to you, Ann. I think this is a good question, an important question, and I'll leave the too big to pay for it to Ann to answer. But in terms of how big the gap is and if a program like this can meet the need is a question the River District, the River District has been engaged in exploring water conservation programs and its potential impacts for several years. And one of these efforts is what we call the risk study, which is looking at the likelihood of compact curtailment and the impacts to that. Who would be shut off, how far you would have to shut off junior water rights or post-compact water rights. And that analysis shows that assuming the current operating rules, which the hope is it will change soon, it changes depending on your hydrology. We've seen the average hydrology in the last 2 decades to be around 12 million acre feet, which is much lower than it was for the last century, which is more like 15. And so when these models were run, and actually let me share my screen because I think it'll just tell the story a little bit better. It's just one quick graphic, I promise. All right. Let me put it in present. So this is, how much water, move this out of the way, is required to keep Lake Powell above the elevation of 3,500. And it assumes 2007 interim guidelines. But these 3 plots or lines in this, curves in this graph, the red one is assuming an average hydrology of 9 million acre feet. The blue line is 11, the green line is 13. And as I mentioned, in the last 20 years, we've been in between the green and the blue lines. And it shows that the whole, right? If you're closer to the green, you're more consistently, this gap is 200,000 acre feet. If you're closer to 11 million acre feet hydrology, this gap is closer to 1 million acre feet. And the 2019 drought contingency plan, when it talks about demand management, it talks about a 500,000 acre foot pool. So depending on the hydrology, that wouldn't be enough. Recent system conservation pilot programs reduced, I think 2024 reduced consumption by, 100,000 acre foot. That's not enough. That's not enough even for 13 million acre foot hydrology. And so I think this just reiterates that a program like this doesn't resolve all of the issues that we're seeing in the basin. And hydrology is very important. And we don't know exactly what it's going to be, right? We models show it's going to be worse. I'll turn it to you, Ann.
Okay. Well, Raquel's graph is great. I'm going to wave my hands around and talk with my hands about the gap. We know there's a gap between supply and demand in the Colorado River Basin. We're using on average more than nature supplies. So we have use up here and supply down here, and this is the gap. Conservation programs help because they decrease demand and help to close that gap. If they're temporary, then at the end of that conservation program, demand goes back up. So we have to think, if we're thinking long-term, we have to think about permanent reductions. And that's hard. That's really, really hard for us to contemplate. But it's an issue for the entire basin. And the gap is big enough. Someone just put in the chat that it's 3 to 4 million acre feet a year. And there's differing opinions about that, but it's big. And it's big enough so that no one basin, no one state, no one sector of the economy can fill that gap, can offset that gap between supply and demand on their own. So everybody has to use less water. And I think that's widely recognized. With respect to permanent reductions, though, and compensated conservation programs, I don't think it's possible to continue to pay people in perpetuity not to use water that's not there. The IRA money runs out next year at the end of fiscal year 2026, so just a little over a year from now. And the prospect for large new appropriations of money to pay for conservation programs, that prospect doesn't seem great right now. So we have to bring the system into balance in a permanent way, not tomorrow, but pretty soon. And it's just not feasible to pay water users over the long term not to use water that doesn't exist.
Thank you so much, Raquel and Ann. Those were phenomenal answers to the really big existential question that's facing everybody in the Colorado River Basin. So this last question is for the three of you, and it's, how can landowners and agricultural producers lead the way in water conservation as the climate continues to challenge assumptions about the amount of water available in the Colorado River Basin, as we've just seen in graphic form and in anecdotal form?
Just jump in and say that we have to have a collective effort for the reasons that I just mentioned. And I think that means that owners of irrigated working lands need to work in concert with municipal suppliers to figure out an equitable balance. Who's going to bear what burden of reduction? It makes perfect sense for agricultural producers to insist that cities bear a portion of the reductions in use that we all know are necessary. But there are also, I think, creative arrangements that need to be explored and implemented. Things like interruptible supply agreements, for example, where the ag producer uses the water in normal or wet years, but the city is able to call for that water in dry years or years where the city's reservoirs are depleted. Farmers and ranchers can experiment with lower use crops and split season irrigation in ways like Mike was talking about to reduce overall use and maybe make the crops more resistant, more resilient as well. But the most important point, I think, in the Colorado River Basin is that for the foreseeable future, we're all going to have to use less water. And It's up to us to figure out how to do that in the most equitable way in order to have more control over our future.
Yeah, I'll jump in and kind of follow up on what Anna said. I look at these graphs and these numbers, and I think to myself, what if we had started doing this program 20 years ago? There's a lot of, hand wringing and worrying about what are the effects of this, that going to be that have resulted in us not doing anything for a long time. And I just wonder what Lake Powell would look like had we implemented a program like this 20 years ago and would be in this situation today. I mean, one of the things that's front and center in our minds with this problem are a series of assumptions that we believe. There's less water available than we thought. Water availability will continue to decrease. Demand will continue to increase, and that demand will be satisfied. And if you believe that, then it really becomes clear that you need to try to solve this problem urgently. And I think where the water is primarily going to come from is agriculture, because that's where the water is. And I think the best outcome for farmers and ranchers is for them to work together to try to figure out how to manage this risk in a way that actually works for them. That's the key thing. There's a lot of well-intentioned people working super hard on this problem, from environmentalists to scientists to policymakers to politicians. And I think they'll ultimately come up with what the solution is, sort of, what the numbers are and whatnot. But the on the ground solution, I think, needs to come from farmers and ranchers. And those folks, in my experience, are innovative, and they are trying new things, and they are running their operations, which are all unique. And to the extent that we can give them the runway to try things and to try to be a part of the solution, I think that would be really helpful. And I realize this kind of work isn't historically on their plate, and folks are busy, but I think farmers and ranchers need to become engaged in this. A lot of them are already, and maybe lean on their industry groups, like Cattlemen's or Farm Bureau or whatnot, where they have policy experts to help them along through this. But I don't think we can wait and see and keep kind of kicking the can down the road, and we need to be proactive in trying to solve these problems.
And I'll add to that I think it's really important for landowners and producers to be engaged in these conversations actively, engaged in the folks that are putting these water conservation programs out there, administering them, creating them, designing them. Because I agree with what Mike was saying, right? The future has less water. And so some things that were done, in certain futures might not be possible anymore. Like, it's just, some things have to change to adapt to that. And I think it's critical to do it in a way that keeps agriculture viable. And there, as I mentioned before, there can be negative consequences of programs like that. And I think a big concern the River District has is to advocate for not a handful of communities to suffer these potential impacts, that these impacts have to be shared with different regions, the basins, the Front Range basins, and areas that use Colorado River. We need participation from them as well. And because local communities can be impacted, right? Like, if you have the landowners that own land but don't live in that local community and are getting compensated for a program like this, but the money doesn't stay in the community, you could have ripple economic impacts. So anyhow, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for those answers. I think we have time for one question at the end of this, just so that we can get everybody out of here on time. But I think we're probably going to go with one from Seth Steyer? Not sure on that one, but this would seem to go hand in hand with regenerative agriculture. Have you specifically targeted ranches and farms with more progressive practices? And Seth, I'm assuming this is about the SCPP and these kinds of programs, but I don't know who would like to pick that one up, but if anybody would like to jump in, please go for it.
I can just say that the SCPP didn't specifically consider that factor. I think it has more of an impact on how you as a working landowner assess the economics. But I think Mike has thought a bit more about this.
Yeah, I mean, again, in my mind, there's sort of two options. There's a full season fallow to a row crop that, a farmer's not going to plant. And that's a very different kind of effect and consideration for that farmer. And then there's, operation like ours, like a cattle operation where you have the hay meadows that, endure drought in different years and can probably endure deficit irrigation, which is, what we've done, what we did last year and what we're continuing to monitor. And we do employ regenerative practices and we do soil monitoring and, high intensity grazing, all of those things. And like I said, we were just doing some monitoring of our irrigated ground, looking at root depths and stuff. And we're trying to see whether you could employ a situation like this where you're not enduring a drought, but you're being paid to conserve water and you're stressing plants in a way that will result in them becoming more resilient. So yes, it's important, I think, both for these compensated programs, but it's also just important for enduring a drier, warmer West.
Great. Thank you, guys. And then, might as well go big on the last one. This is from Mark Hayden. Are mandatory caps on usage likely to be made by the federal government, or are we likely to dry up the Colorado River before anything serious happens?
Raquel alluded to this, but the entire Colorado River system is in the middle of determining what our next set of operating rules is going to look like, because our current rules expire next year. There have been intense and very long discussions among the 7 Colorado River Basin states about what kind of framework they would like to see embodied in the next set of operating rules. Unfortunately, those discussions haven't yet come up with a consensus framework about what that would look like. It's obviously desirable to have the states come up with something that they can live with, because again, that gives us more control over our future, and states can decide how they're going to address their cut, their burden of the reductions in demand that are necessary over the entire system. Each state will have some responsibility for that, and we can control what that looks like. If there isn't a consensus agreement, though, the Department of the Interior has told us repeatedly that they are ready to step in and tell us what that next set of operating rules will look like. And it's impossible for anybody to design a set of rules that everybody will be happy with. So we can assume that there will be great consternation and concern and possibly litigation if the federal government does impose a set of rules, because there will be unhappy water users no matter what happens. Hopefully we can avoid that scenario. And the states are working hard to try to come up with a consensus framework. And now they're pursuing a kind of operating scheme that would be what they call supply driven, meaning that we would take a look at the last 3 years of average supply, kind of like the graph that Raquel last showed us, see what the actual hydrological situation is, and then allocate the available water based on a percentage of whatever that 3-year average was. So the upper basin would get a percentage, the lower basin would get a percentage. Those would be divided out among the states. That has a lot of promise, I think, for a number of different reasons. So it's hard to answer your question, Seth, but there could be a bunch of different potential answers.
Great. If you guys are good on that one, Raquel or Mike, I don't know if you want to chip in there. Sounds good. Well, thank you all so much, because it looks like we're all out of time today. A huge thank you to our speakers, And thanks to all of you for attending our webinar today. As a reminder, we will send out the recording and recap next week. And finally, we would like to thank the Walton Family Foundation and all of our partners for supporting our water program, and for all of our members for supporting WLA and our mission. If you're interested in donating, please see the link in the chat. Thank you, and have a great rest of your week, and enjoy your Independence Day. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.